Hi, today we're looking at the Metadata Entry Tool that's been developed for creating catalogue records for the Indigenous Data Network. This tool can be used to create any metadata records compatible with the DCAT standard. That's the data catalogue standard. But it includes specialised fields and tagging vocabularies for creating records that conform to the IDN catalogue profile. That's the Indigenous Data Network cataloguing profile. You can use this tool to create records for various types of content, which we'll call datasets, such as documents, video content, or even sound recordings. The Metadata Entry Tool supports creation of Indigenous datasets. What are Indigenous datasets? There are a number of factors used to identify and evaluate datasets for their connection and relation to Indigenous culture, such as subject agents. Is the dataset about an Indigenous person or organisation? Agent contributors. Is the dataset created by or the responsibility of an Indigenous person or organisation? Themes or subjects. Is the dataset about Indigenous things? Governance. Is the dataset subject to an Indigenous data policy? Languages. Is the dataset content delivered in an Indigenous language? We'll see that each of these indicators of Indigenous dataset content are addressed in different sections of the Metadata Entry Tool. We'll also show you how to fill out basic metadata fields such as titles, descriptions, and rights information that you will usually see in any metadata. Before we get started with a sample record, we should explain that this tool is designed to support creation of metadata, and the tool can be used to submit the metadata directly to the Indigenous Data Network catalogue, where it will be reviewed for inclusion. But you can also view and download any metadata that you create without submitting it. This can be useful for testing and trialling the tool, or for sharing draft metadata within your own workflows. Please note this section of the metadata tool. Click the RDF button to show the metadata as it is created. RDF, or the Resource Description Framework, is the metadata format that this tool creates. You can copy or download this RDF at any point while editing a catalogue record. Okay, let's get cataloguing. Now, the general form is where you create basic information about the dataset, such as the title. Give the record a title. Of course, this step is mandatory. A title helps catalogue users to select the dataset from a search page, and the title itself will be searchable. IRI. An IRI is a special kind of unique identifier for your metadata record. You can see here that the Metadata Entry Tool automatically generates a unique IRI, and this always follows a pattern where the stem is data.idnu.org/PID. That's PID for persistent identifier /resource. You don't need to change this IRI, but you may if you already have a web-based identifier for the resource. For example, a digital object identifier may exist for a dataset, as you might find for a journal article, for example. Indigeneity. The indigeneity field is not mandatory. You can use this field to make a broad statement about whether the dataset is either about Indigenous people, about Indigenous things, or by Indigenous people. Note that there are other ways of indicating this elsewhere in the tool. Description. The description field must be filled out. Describe here what the resource is about. You might be able to just copy an abstract or a summary from the resource content into this field. If the description mentions Indigenous things, people, or organisations, this will also help to determine the Indigenous nature of the resource and help catalogue users who are selecting the resource from a search result summary. Traditionally, Cataloging guidelines say that a description should be brief, indicative, and non-evaluative. But in this tool, feel free to include as much text as you like. Modern systems can interpret longer descriptions and extract the important information automatically. So the more relevant detail you add here, the better. Indigenous Data Governance Policy. We need to know if there is a policy governing the resource, some policy responsible for its existence or its ongoing management. Here, select from either Data Governance, Data Management or Data Policy. You see here that each policy type is described in the drop-down options. Also, a URL to locate the policy. This may be an IRI of another dataset already catalogued within the IDN, or just a URL to some other location. Also, write a short description describing the policy. If metadata and data archiving is included in the policy, indicate this with the checkbox here. Okay, that's our general metadata filled out. Now let's look at agent information. Agent information. An agent can be a person or an organisation. Agents will have different roles with respect to the dataset. You can use this form to indicate who or what the agent is and what role they play with respect to the creation or management of the dataset. Each agent must have a matching role. Okay, so let's create an agent. The very first step is to see if the agent you need for the record has been created before. We don't want to create duplicate agents. Use the search for an agent feature here to check. Okay, the agent we want is not already created, so the next step is to create a custom agent by clicking the editor button. This launches a new form. You'll notice in this form that an IRI has already been minted for a new agent. By default, the IRI is structured for an organisation record. Let's change that to person using the type field. Let's give the agent a name. We can add a URL for the agent. This might be a website for an organisation or some kind of profile page for a person, for example. Now use the description field to add any information that will tell a catalogue user more about the agent or to help distinguish or disambiguate who the agent is. Names are not unique, so it's a good idea to provide some context here about the agent to help clarify their identity. Indigeneity. Okay, here's where we can indicate the indigenous status of the agent. Note here that because our agent is a person, there are three options to choose from: Indigenous, Indigenous status unknown, and non-Indigenous. Watch what happens when I change the record to an organisation type. This drop-down list changes to different options. You can see here there are a few more options to pick for an organisation. Identifier. Is there a standard identifier already available for the agent? Enter this here. An identifier links the agent record to even more information. The identifier data type options are for either a person and an organisation. The only one here that works for a person is OrcID, or the Open Research and Contributor ID. The rest are for organisations here. Relations. There may be some formal relationship between the agent and another agent. You can define this relationship if the agent is already in the IDN agents database. Use the search to look up a related agent. For example, if an agent is a member of a university, you can define this here. Okay, we're ready to save our agent information. And back to the main form. Dates. You must enter a date for when the resource was created. You can just enter the year, but add the month and day also if that's known. Also add a modified date. If the resource has not been modified, just make this the same date as the created date. The resource may have been issued, meaning published or distributed, at a date later than the creation date. This field is optional. Rights. You can indicate any rights associated with the resource. For licenses, you can select from all rights reserved and a number of different Creative Commons licenses or public domain. Access rights are different from licenses. Access rights indicate the conditions for accessing the resource. Access may be restricted or protected, or limited to an Indigenous community access. Or of course it may be open access. Select this if there are no restrictions on accessing the resource. The rights field is a free text field and should indicate the agent or agents that own the rights to the data so that they can be quoted. This can just be an agent name, but it may also be a longer descriptive statement. Spatial and temporal. The spatial and temporal field is where you can describe spatial and temporal information relevant to the resource. Note that this is different from when the resource was created or modified. For example, a resource may be created today, but it may be about some issue or event occurring in the past. Use that past date range to indicate the topics discussed in the resource. Same for spatial information. This is not necessarily where the resource was created, although it may be that as well. For spatial information, you can add an IRI relating to some spatial feature. Some useful sources of IRIs for spatial features include geonames, a global source of IRIs for spatial features, the IDN catalogue itself. A spatial feature may already be catalogued, so use one of these IRIs. And the linked data PID register, which is a collection of persistent identifiers for spatial features. For temporal aspects of the resource, you can just add the year and the month, or the year, month and day if they are known. Note also that for spatial, you can also add GeoJSON strings or well-known text strings. There are some examples here. Distribution information. This is optional information you can add when there is a publicly available URL that gives the user access to the data. Theme. Add an Indigenous theme or subject using the IDN themes vocabulary. You can use this form to look up and select themes. Contact details. The last field in the Metadata Entry Tool is the Contact Details field. These details are required if you are submitting this metadata to the IDN. These details are also added at the point of contact for this catalogue record unless you've specifically indicated a point of contact as a role in the agent information form. Fair and care scores. You may notice in the Metadata Entry Tool a fair score and a care score field. These scoring tools use the metadata you have entered to provide a score for fair and care. So, what are fair and care? FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The F for fair score is incremented as you add descriptive metadata such as title, description, and the themes. The A is for accessible score, is incremented as you add values from the access rights field in the rights form. The I for interoperability score is incremented by metadata that is machine readable and uses shared vocabularies and ontologies. Don't worry, the form is supporting you in doing this. Whenever you select a value from agent roles, policy types, themes and so on in the tool is making your catalogue record interoperable. And the R is for reusable. If you have indicated rights and licenses, this score will be incremented. Where the catalogue record refers to their sources, such as distribution URL, which enables proper citation, the score will also increment. So that's fair. What about care? Care principles to address a clear deficit in fair regarding Indigenous people's rights and interests. CARE is the acronym for C. Collective benefit. The collective benefit score is incremented as you add metadata that makes the resource discoverable, enabling Indigenous people to derive benefit from the resource. The A is for authority to control. Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognised and the authority to control such data be empowered. The A for authority to control is incremented as license rights and access rights are completed. Responsibility. Those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. By indicating the Indigenous status of persons and organisations that own or manage the resource, the responsibility score will be incremented. And the E is for ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data life cycle and across the data ecosystems. Ensuring that your metadata is discoverable and searchable will increment this score, as well as adding rights information. Note also in the tool, if you want to have a more detailed look at what's going on with the scoring, you can click on the scorer and have a look at each element and how they're calculated. Thanks very much for listening to this tutorial about the Metadata Entry Tool.